At 80 years old, Michael Douglas finally stopped pretending that survival was the same as victory. For decades, the world believed his life followed a familiar Hollywood arc: talent, fame, love, resilience, triumph. A legendary actor married to one of the most dazzling women of his generation. A man who beat cancer. A couple who walked red carpets again as proof that love conquers all. But behind that polished narrative was a quieter truth, one he had spent years avoiding because it didn't sound heroic. It was the truth that the greatest suffering of his life didn't come from scandal, betrayal, or public collapse. It came from silence, from the slow erosion of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside while quietly unraveling within, from loving someone deeply and still failing to protect them from the weight of your world. Michael would later say that some moments never loosen their grip no matter how many years pass. For him, one of those moments arrived late at night in 2010, long before the public knew how close he was to losing everything. He had just returned from another doctor's appointment, another hallway, another sterile room, another conversation that drained the life from his voice. He sat down, exhausted, unable to hide the fear that had begun to live permanently in his chest. Across the room, Catherine Zeta-Jones watched him in silence. She didn't know what to say, not because she didn't love him, but because she could already feel something breaking that neither of them had the strength to name. Their marriage, once defined by glamour, laughter, and public fascination, had quietly transformed into something else entirely. Not a war of shouting or accusations, but a battlefield of unspoken fears. A place where both were fighting different enemies, alone, while standing only feet apart. That year, Michael Douglas was diagnosed with stage 4 throat cancer. It was the kind of diagnosis that doesn't just threaten a body, it dismantles identity. Fame instantly became irrelevant. Money lost its meaning. Applause felt distant and hollow. None of it mattered when a doctor calmly explained the odds and left him alone with his thoughts. And the truth Michael rarely admitted was this: he didn't fear death as much as he feared what dying would do to the people he loved. Catherine had already spent years living under scrutiny. Tabloids dissected her marriage, her choices, her every public appearance. She was criticized for loving an older man, judged for standing beside him, and expected to remain flawless while carrying a life few could imagine. Now she was being asked to carry something no partner is prepared for: the possibility of losing her husband just as their children needed stability most. Behind closed doors, their home grew colder. Not because love faded, but because pain multiplied. Michael fought for his life. Catherine fought to keep herself intact as her bipolar disorder, long managed, never erased, returned with overwhelming force. Some days, she sat beside him for hours, whispering reassurance, clinging to hope as if repetition could make it real. Other days, she disappeared behind locked doors, paralyzed by the terror of watching the man she loved slowly weaken. And during those long nights, Michael learned something he had never expected to learn so late in life. The true horrors of marriage are not loud. They are not dramatic explosions or public betrayals. They are the silent hours when two people who love each other realize they cannot save one another. Long before illness entered their lives, the foundation had already begun to crack. From the outside, Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones represented Hollywood perfection. He was the powerful veteran, seasoned and respected. She was the rising star, brilliant, beautiful, and seemingly unstoppable. Together, they were photographed as proof that love could transcend age, status, and time. But fame has a way of amplifying insecurities that would otherwise remain manageable. Their troubles didn't begin with cancer or mental illness. They began with distance, physical, emotional, and professional. In the early 2000s, their careers pulled them in opposite directions. Catherine traveled across Europe, collecting awards and momentum. Michael remained in the United States, balancing acting, producing, and responsibilities from a life he had built long before meeting her. Nights apart turned into weeks. Conversations grew shorter. What was once shared freely began to feel rationed. Michael often remembered one phone call that haunted him for years. Catherine was filming in Berlin, exhausted after another long day. Her voice was soft, uncertain, an insecurity she rarely allowed herself to show. "Are you still awake?" she asked. "Or is someone keeping you awake?" It wasn't an accusation. It was fear. Catherine had married a man with a past she could never fully erase. Michael Douglas had once been famous not just for his talent, but for his appetite, for attention, for women, for life lived loudly. Though he had changed, the shadow of who he used to be followed them both. Michael reassured her. He told her he was alone, that those days were behind him, but silence lingered on the line. And he knew she wasn't fully convinced. What Michael never admitted, perhaps even to himself, was that he carried his own fear. Watching Catherine's fame skyrocket, while he grew older, left him feeling like a man slowly fading beside a woman growing brighter by the day. He loved her fiercely. But admiration can quietly transform into insecurity when time begins to favor only one of you. He once said privately that the world admired them as a couple, but inside, he no longer knew how to keep up. Those were the early horrors, not betrayal, not anger, but the realization that love alone cannot silence the doubts that fame plants inside a marriage. By 2009, Michael had become skilled at ignoring discomfort. A sore throat, fatigue, an ache he blamed on travel and age. When the diagnosis finally came, it split his life in two. Stage 4 throat cancer. Everything fractured in that moment. He remembered coming home that day and finding Catherine in the yard with their children, Dylan and Karis. She was laughing, unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted. Michael stood there longer than necessary, memorizing the sound of their voices, the warmth of the afternoon light, the way Dylan called for his sister. He didn't know if he would ever see that moment again. Telling Catherine was one of the hardest things he had ever done. She froze. Then she cried, not because she feared becoming a widow, but because she understood what would be demanded of her. Strength, poise, silence, the role of the unbreakable wife. She had already fought her own storms for years. Now she would have to stand beside a man who might not survive the year. Chemotherapy began, and Michael's world collapsed into cycles of pain and quiet terror. His voice changed. His strength vanished. The man who once commanded rooms could no longer climb a flight of stairs. Catherine stayed with him through every treatment, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. But as his body weakened, her illness resurfaced with brutal force. Some days, she whispered hope into the air. Other days, she withdrew completely, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't control. Michael would later confess that the darkest realization wasn't the possibility of death. It was understanding that they were suffering separately even while lying in the same bed. They loved each other. But love did not grant immunity from fear. By 2013, Michael Douglas had beaten cancer. The world celebrated his survival. Cameras returned. Smiles reappeared. Headlines praised resilience. But survival came with an aftershock no one expected. The marriage he had fought so desperately to stay alive for no longer felt familiar. Catherine's bipolar disorder had intensified during his illness. Michael had fallen into a deep depression. He hid behind interviews and appearances. They lived under the same roof, but drifted in opposite emotional directions. Nights, once filled with whispered promises, became silent. Two people staring into darkness, wondering when partnership had turned into coexistence. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived quietly. One evening in August 2013, Michael came home to find Catherine packing a suitcase. No accusations. No anger. Just exhaustion. "I need to breathe," she said. When he asked when she'd be back, her answer was devastating in its honesty. If there's still anything left to say. The headlines erupted. Separation after 13 years. Speculation flourished. But the real story was far lonelier. Michael wandered through his New York apartment like a ghost, reading about his family in tabloids instead of seeing them. Catherine retreated to Bermuda with the children, rebuilding her strength while protecting them from the collapse unfolding around them. Michael later admitted that the separation didn't break him. It clarified him. For the first time, he confronted a version of himself he had avoided for decades. A man who spent more energy appearing strong than allowing himself to be emotionally available. During those months, he reread old letters from Catherine, notes from the beginning. One line struck him with unbearable clarity. "I'm scared the light around you will burn me, yet I still want to be near you." He had once found it romantic. Now, he understood it was a warning. In January 2014, he finally wrote her a letter, not an apology, but a truth. "I still believe in what we had." Her reply arrived a week later. Just 3 words. "I haven't forgotten." 3 months later, Catherine walked back through the door. Not triumphant, not certain, simply willing. They didn't rebuild their marriage with grand gestures. They rebuilt it quietly. Coffee in the morning, gardening, conversations about their children without fear. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. By the time Michael turned 80, the storms had softened. Fame no longer roared. Their children had grown. Silence remained, but now it was shared, not destructive. Michael finally admitted the truth he once feared. He had loved Catherine deeply, but not always the way she needed. And the greatest horror of marriage, he realized, wasn't betrayal. It was silence. Silence during illness. Silence during emotional pain. Silence when both were too tired to ask for help. At 80, Michael Douglas said the words he had avoided for years. "I stayed strong for too long." And then something even more unexpected. Catherine never abandoned him, even when she had every reason to. Because love, he says now, isn't what happens on red carpets. Love is the person who walks back into your life after they've already walked out. After everything they endured, Michael Douglas finally understands what real love costs. What do you think kept their marriage alive through so many storms?